Today, we're on Chapter 31, Section 2, which is going to talk about the Great Depression. The Great Depression, as we learn about it in the United States, it really did affect our economy here on the home front, but it really was a worldwide depression. Not a lot of students really recall that or really understand that, this depression that took place in the United States was something that was going on worldwide in between the two world wars. So let's get right into it today, gentlemen. We have a couple of charts that I may glance over that are in the outlines that I did post on the bulletin board and in the assignments for you guys to study. So I may have you refer to those charts and we can move faster through the lesson. Roman numeral 1 is going to talk about post-war Europe. We're talking post-World War I here. In the late 1920s, a lot of European nations really were looking for ways to rebuild their war-torn economies. The United States did their part by providing very large loans to many of those European nations to help them rebuild. Why? Why would the United States do that? Well, humanitarian efforts are one of the things that the United States has done throughout its history, but also, there's an economic driving point there. If those countries are struggling, their trade value with the United States would not be very strong. So by helping them rebuild their economies, it would help us in the long run. Now, capital letter B is going to talk about Europe's new democracies that formed coming out of things like the Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference. Russia is actually one of those. I don't know if many of you know this, but in 1917, there was a short-term provisional government that was established with a constitution and democratic rule. It didn't last very long. It was replaced by the communist dictatorship within months, but it was there for a moment. So democracy was spreading throughout the world. The majority of Europe, though, became democratic. And this was a tough transition because if you remember, for the longest time, many of the countries and regions that we learned about were controlled by monarchs, kings, queens, emperors that ruled these nations for a very historic time period. Countries had a very large amount of political parties, and this made it really difficult to govern effectively. In our country, you generally have the Democratic Party and you have the Republican Party, and then you might have some offshooting. You might have some libertarians, you might have some independents, you might have the Green Party, things of that nature going on. But really, there's two big ones. In these countries, there were maybe 8, 9, sometimes 12 political parties that were vying for control. So what these countries did is they came up with what are called coalition governments. Coalition governments are temporary alliances of several parties that would be necessary to form a parliamentary majority. Let's say in country X, you have 10 political parties. And when it comes to voting times, the candidates from each of those parties get 10% of the vote each. Well, is that really a political majority? Let's say that one gets 11 and one gets 9 and the rest have 10. Well, does the 11% really represent a parliamentary majority? Not exactly. So by combining maybe one that had 11, one that had 15, one that had 22, by combining those three major political parties, you then form a majority. They didn't always get along, but at least you had some form of control there. Oftentimes they split into factions, which didn't really turn out all that well in the long run. One of the situations like this was going on in Germany. There's something called the Vie Mar Republic. Remember, in German, the W's are usually pronounced as V's. So the Weimar Republic, Germany's new democratic government, was set up in 1919, fresh out of World War I. You have to remember, like I said earlier in this lesson, Germany lacked a strong democratic tradition. So this government was in constant competition with other political parties. Many German citizens blamed the Weimar for the country's loss in World War I and also the post-war humiliation caused by the Treaty of Versailles, which you guys learned about in the last chapter. One of the big issues here was economics, and that's going to be inflation in Germany. One of the things that caused this is that Germany did not raise taxes during World War I. What they did is they simply printed money. This is a problem. After the war, this printed money steadily lost its value. Germans then began to print more money, which was a huge mistake. The value of the German mark, which was their currency, continued to drop. Inflation set in so bad in Germany, and this is called hyperinflation, extreme inflation, and this could be noted by the price of bread in Germany by these dates I'm going to talk about with you here. In 1918 toward the end of the war, a loaf of bread cost less than 1 German mark. Now, just 4 years later, in 1922, post-war, that same loaf of bread would cost 160 marks. Now, the translation is not exactly the same, but imagine the price of bread jumping in 4 years from $1 to $160. Look at this. Only 1 year later, in 1923, one loaf of bread in Germany cost consumers 200 million marks. That's not a type error. That's not a joke. People literally had to take wheelbarrows full of money to buy their groceries. I have a chart about this in your notes. I'm not going to go over it today, right now, just for the purpose of time, and you have that. But this is sort of the cycle that they went through in this time period. Also, in 1923, $1 was worth over 4 trillion marks. That is astronomical. Let me show you some pictures in Germany of what people were doing with German marks or their currency. Here, just by doing German inflation post-World War I, you see kids making paper houses. You generally use playing cards to make these. They were using their currency. That's how worthless it was. Women were sewing dresses out of the marks. People were making poster boards out of it. People were going to stores with carts like this just to buy a couple of items. Children making a kite. People burned money to stay warm. That's how bad it had gotten in Germany, gentlemen. Let's go back to the lesson here. How did they get out of that? Well, capital letter C talks about attempts for economic stability. The Americans actually helped out. One thing is called the Dawes Plan. This was put forth by Charles Dawes, who was an American banker at the time. He proposed a $200 million loan from American banks to stabilize the German currency and help out its economy in 1924. What the United States also did was set a more achievable schedule of reparation payments. Remember, after World War I, Germany took the brunt of the blame. They owed the Allies, who had won the war, millions of dollars in reparations. And so the United States set a more achievable schedule of those reparation payments, trying to ease the burden on Germany. By 1929, Germany was headed back into the production and economic power that they once were. And a lot of this was thanks to the Dawes Plan. Adolf Hitler didn't really thank the United States for that. Remember, he had a lot of hatred for the U.S., and this was restructuring, this rebuild of the German economy probably would not have happened without United States intervention. Capital letter D, efforts for peace. The foreign ministers of the countries of France and Germany met in 1924 as well at a conference in Switzerland. A couple other countries in that region, Belgium, Italy, Great Britain, were also present. There was a treaty signed at this negotiation between France and Germany, bitter rivalries for a long time, that they would never make war on each other again. Wow, what a joke that was. We know just a couple of years later, well, not really a couple, but, a matter of years later, we had World War II. Germany was also admitted into the League of Nations. And in 1928, there was something called the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact. Really, this is another joke in history, in my opinion, because this was put together by the United States Secretary Frank Kellogg and also France's Foreign Minister Aristide Briand. On this peace pact, almost every country in the world signed on, including Russia, and they literally pledged to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Now, if you're renouncing war as an instrument of national policy, then that means you really don't need to have a military. Do you think any of these countries stopped military production and preparation? Indeed, they did not. So this really was kind of a moot point, in my opinion. It really didn't lead to much. As you know, this was going on in 1928. In the late 1930s, we have, the outbreak of World War II. So this was really kind of a useless ideology there. But I would say I do give them credit for at least meeting and talking world peace. I like that a lot. Roman numeral 3, we're going to talk about what really this section is predicated on the financial collapse. We're going to start with the United States economy. There were a lot of weaknesses in the U.S. economy. Here are some. An uneven distribution of wealth between the rich and the poor, still present today. Overproduction by business and agriculture. This one, not as present today, but could become a problem if consumers are making less money and more people get laid off, then that could become a problem. Also, you have less, or you could say fewer, if you wanted to be grammatically correct, Americans buying goods. That's the problem. When consumers aren't going to stores and aren't spending their money, then those stores cannot afford to pay their employees, and then sometimes they have to go out of business. Unfortunately, we're experiencing that right now. Despite these weaknesses in the United States, the economy here was the strongest in the world. By 1929, United States factories were producing about 50% of the world's industrial goods. We were the industrial powerhouse of the world at this time. Rising productivity led to enormous profits, but unfortunately, in the United States, the wealth was not evenly distributed. The richest 5% of the population received 33% of all personal income in 1929. But the fact of that is that 60% of all American families, 60%, earn less than $2,000 per year in the early 1930s. Moving on, there is a chart. I'm going to go over this chart because this one's a little bit important to what we're going to talk about for the rest of this lesson. Families were just too poor to buy the goods that were being produced, so stores cut back on their orders from factories because they just simply could not sell all their goods. If you guys shop at Walmart or you shop at Target, they have workers that are on the sales floor with little scanners, and they're scanning barcodes on the shelves, and it's going to say, "Hey, how many of these do we have in stock in the back room, in the stock room? How many do we have on the floor? How many here on the shelves? How many have we sold today? How many have we sold this week? How many have we sold this month?" And that's going to tell them how much they need to order. If those things are not moving off the shelves, they're going to cut back on their orders from factories. Factories then are going to be producing less, and so they're going to have to lay off workers, which are going to reduce their production. This is a downward economic spiral. As factories begin to lay off workers, stores begin to lay off workers, and that means that those workers do not have as much money to spend on non-essential goods and essential goods in stores. So as more workers lose their jobs, families are then going to start to reserve what they buy. They're going to start to ration, and they're going to buy less or fewer goods. And then factories are going to make even more cuts. Unfortunately, guys, this is what our country is facing today. This is a very scary situation. And that's why there's this big debate about opening up the economy and reopening the economy. It's predicated on this type of history, guys. So this is really pertinent to today's world, unfortunately. Capital letter B, let's talk about some of the reasons why in the late 1920s, early 1930s, we had this issue. There was an overproduction of agriculture. American farmers simply were producing more food than people had demand for. Remember, with economics, it's all about supply and demand. If we go back to Adam Smith, his law of supply and demand, that really holds true in a lot of situations. This drove prices and profits down because when the supply is high, and of course the demand is low, then the price of said good is going to be low. Now, if demand is high and supply is low, if it were reverse, then the price would be high. That would be good for businesses. But this is a worldwide problem, not just happening in the United States. This caused many farmers. Now, you got to think about farmers. They have a lot of land. We're talking about $1 million loans from banks for farm equipment, farm storage, the farmhouse, paying the farm employees, and then, of course, the land. The land is money. The land is power. But because those loans are so large, if you cut the profit of farmers and they can't pay back banks, these are some of the biggest loans that banks give out. And when they're not getting a return on those loans, this caused some banks to weaken and even some to close. Let's talk about this, guys. When you put your money in the bank, your money is then dispersed. Obviously, you have your money as a guarantee today, but back in these times, the bank would take in your money. They would give you a loan maybe for your home, but they'd give these farmers these large loans. When the return wasn't coming back in, you went to the bank to get your money out. The bank would say, "Sorry, we don't have your money," and you lost it. There was no insurance on that money until after this happened. We'll talk about that here shortly, but people lost all of their money in these small banks that had to close, sometimes large banks. This led into the stock market crash. We'll talk about that briefly here. In 1929, things were going well. this is before these economic downturns happened. Everyone wanted to get in on the stock market. Even middle income people began to buy stocks on what are called the margin. This was a problem. What this meant is that the people who were purchasing the stock only paid a small percentage of the stock's price as a down payment. The rest of the price of the stock, they borrowed from the stockbroker on a loan. So let's say a share of stock was $1. These middle income people would pay maybe 20% of it. So they're paying 20 cents a stock share. The broker is fronting them the other 80 cents. This works when stock prices are rising, but when stocks start to fall, people don't have the money to pay those brokers' loans. Then the broker's out and the consumer's out, and this is a bad downward spiral. In September of 1929, investors who were buying stocks began to sell their shares of stock because they thought prices were extremely high and they would be sure to drop soon. So they were trying to sell when the price was high so that they could make more money, understanding that when prices are high, eventually they're going to fall, and then you won't have as much money in to sell. So they started to sell, and everybody starts doing this. On Thursday, October 24th, the stock prices began to significantly drop, which resulted in a panic. Everybody else wanted to now sell their stocks before it fell too low, and nobody was buying. This is how stock markets crash. I'm keeping it simple here. I'm not a broker, okay, but I'm just talking about some of the basics here. On Tuesday, October 29th, a record 16 million stocks were sold, which caused the market to crash. This is really one of the monumental happenings of the Great Depression. People lost millions of dollars in the stock market. The Great Depression. This was a historic time period, which really led into a long business slump following this stock market crash. Unemployment rates began to rise. The industrial production, prices, and wages declined. By 1932, factory production was cut in half. Around 9 million people lost all of their money in savings accounts because banks had to close and they didn't have any money to pay them. Now, today, we have what's called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So when you deposit money in a bank, the government will guarantee you up to $250,000. That is guaranteed. If you have $500,000 in the bank and markets crash and banks close, you are only guaranteed $250,000. Please note, $250,000 is all you're insured in banks. Now, if you diversify your accounts, if you have an account here of $250,000, an account there in another bank of $250,000, then that might be a way to work around it. I'm not an expert at this, trust me. But I'm just going to show you the FDIC website here at the top. Each depositor insured to at least $250,000 per insured bank. Now that's at least. So some banks might insure you for more, but this is pretty standard. The standard insurance amount is $250,000 per depositor per insured bank for each account ownership category. So you can go right here and find out exactly what I'm talking about. This is something that happened after these banks were closing due to farmers losing their land, and a quarter of America's workers were unemployed. Guys, during this time, the unemployment rate was at 25%. This led into a global depression. Because the world was so dependent on the U.S. economy, the depression had a global impact. World trade dropped by 65%. Unemployment rates worldwide soared. Germany, Austria, big parts of Asia, Great Britain, and Latin America were all affected by this downward economic spiral. The final Roman numeral here, Roman numeral 5, I'm going to keep it brief. The world confronts the crisis. How did the world try to fix these problems? Great Britain created a political coalition on this. They passed tariffs or taxes and started to regulate the currency. This led to a very slow recovery, but did preserve democracy. Please refer to your textbook, which you were supposed to read before viewing this lesson, which has a little bit more detail on that. Capital letter B, with France, they underwent a lot of political instability. They did create a coalition government, which I talked about earlier today, to create reforms for workers. However, price increases in stores on consumer goods offset a lot of the wage increases. So really there wasn't much growth there, but they were able to save democracy. In the United States, I'm going to once again keep it brief. This is world history class. Next year, you're going to have an entire class on U.S. history. So you're going to learn a lot about this. I know for a fact that there's several chapters talking about FDR and the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, was elected in 1932. He developed a plan to fix the Depression. It was known as the New Deal. It was basically government reform that was meant to fix the problems of the Depression. A lot of what you'll learn about next year are public works projects, something called the CCC, help to provide jobs for the unemployed, the type of work that we're talking about for unemployed people, planting trees, agricultural work, building roads, infrastructure, building bridges, clean up the highway projects, right? You see, like sometimes we have prisoners doing that today, but these were jobs that were given to people to get them some money so that they could use that money in stores to help the economy start to grow. This provided a lot of money to farmers also, these New Deal programs, which helped them resurge their farms, get agriculture going again. Today, agriculture is one of our biggest economic assets, okay? It's one of the things that we really do export, and we don't really export much. Also provided money to businesses so that they could keep paying their employers and keep their systems running. It did also create some reforms in the stock market and the banking system, which we sort of alluded to with the FDIC there. The New Deal, it worked. It worked to restore the American economy, but really, if you ask me, and many historians would probably agree, what really led us out of the Depression was World War II. Because during World War II, almost everyone had a job providing for military items and necessities. The unemployment rate during World War II was at an all-time low of 1.2%. Just to put that into perspective, guys, prior to the coronavirus affecting our country, the unemployment rate was also very low at around 3.5%, one of the historic lows under this current time period. And unfortunately, that is going to change, and there's going to be a lot of changes that, we're already dealing with, fellows. I want to encourage you guys to finish the year strong. We're at less than 8 lessons left, fellas. We are getting short on our time. I really miss you, and I have enjoyed this year up to this point. I'm sad that we're not going to see each other in person, but of course, next year when we're back in school, I want to see you guys a lot. Hey, remember to keep folks who are affected by this virus in your prayers. Please pray for all the people who have lost their jobs. And, I really wish you guys the best. Thank you.